May 23, 1940. 14:35 hours. Village outskirts, northern France. Oberleutnant Heinrich Kropp, commanding a Panzer III, had been advancing through what remained of Allied resistance for 3 days. The battle was essentially won. French forces were collapsing. British forces were retreating toward Dunkirk, and German armor was exploiting breakthrough with the mechanical efficiency that characterized blitzkrieg at its finest. Kropp's tank had encountered minimal opposition all morning, crushing through defensive positions that couldn't stop modern armor. Then something extraordinary happened. A small, tracked vehicle, perhaps 8 feet long and 5 feet wide, shot across the road ahead of his tank at remarkable speed. The thing was open-topped, barely armored, and carried what appeared to be 3 British soldiers crammed into a space that seemed impossibly small for human occupancy. It moved with mechanical urgency that suggested either recklessness or desperation. Kropp's gunner tracked the vehicle, preparing to engage, but before he could fire, the tiny machine had disappeared behind a stone barn. Kropp ordered his driver to follow, expecting to crush whatever British last stand was occurring. But when his panzer rounded the barn, the small vehicle was already 200 yards away, moving at speed that belied its ungainly appearance, heading toward British lines. "What in God's name was that?" Kropp's loader asked. "I don't know," Kropp admitted. "Some sort of British tractor?" They would encounter 6 more of these vehicles that afternoon, sometimes carrying troops, sometimes mounting machine guns, sometimes simply racing across battlefields on missions that made no apparent sense. One vehicle appeared carrying wounded soldiers. Another towed an anti-tank gun. A third seemed to be scouting German positions, despite being laughably vulnerable to any weapon larger than a rifle. They moved too fast to target effectively, disappeared into cover before German gunners could acquire them properly, and seemed to operate with complete disregard for their obvious inadequacy as combat vehicles. Kropp survived the war and wrote extensively about his combat experiences. His memoir included a peculiar observation about British equipment. The British Universal Carrier was the most maddeningly effective vehicle we encountered, not because it was dangerous, it barely qualified as armored, but because it was everywhere. Every British unit possessed them. They moved supplies, evacuated wounded, scouted positions, mounted weapons, and generally performed every function that military operations required. They were impossible to eliminate completely because there were so many, and destroying one accomplished nothing because 5 more would appear. They represented British pragmatism at its finest. Build something adequate that works reliably rather than something perfect that works occasionally. That assessment, written in 1957, captured essential truth about the Universal Carrier. It was never the best vehicle for any specific task, but it was good enough for almost every task, and Britain produced so many that adequate capability multiplied by universal availability created overwhelming effectiveness. The agricultural origins. The Universal Carrier's development traced back to 1934 and had nothing to do with glamorous military requirements or cutting-edge armor theory. Britain's military planners were examining mechanization, replacing horses with vehicles for transporting equipment and personnel, and needed something cheap, simple, and adequate for basic utility work. The initial concept was borrowed from agricultural machinery, a small, tracked vehicle that could traverse rough terrain, carry modest loads, and operate reliably without requiring extensive maintenance. Vickers Armstrongs Limited received development contracts for what was initially called a tankette, a term suggesting something tank-like but fundamentally different from actual tanks. The design that emerged was utilitarian to the point of ugliness. A small tracked chassis, perhaps 12 feet long and 7 feet wide, powered by a Ford V8 engine producing 85 horsepower, capable of carrying 3 to 5 men plus equipment. Armor was minimal, 7 millimeters at thickest points, which would stop rifle rounds, but nothing more substantial. The vehicle was open-topped, meaning crews were exposed to overhead threats, but this reduced weight and production cost while providing good visibility. The tracks were the design's most important feature. They distributed weight effectively, allowing the vehicle to cross soft ground, mud, sand, and rough terrain that wheeled vehicles couldn't traverse. Ground pressure was sufficiently low that carriers could operate in conditions that bogged down trucks and even some tanks. This cross-country mobility would prove more valuable than armor protection across countless operational situations. Initial variants were specialized: Bren Gun Carriers for machine gunners, scout carriers for reconnaissance, cavalry carriers for mounted troops. Each variant had slightly different configurations optimized for specific roles. This specialization created logistical complications as military units needed to maintain different spare parts inventories for vehicles that were mechanically similar but not identical. The solution came in 1940 with the Universal designation, a standardized design that could perform all roles through different equipment loadouts rather than structural modifications. One basic chassis could mount machine guns, carry mortars, transport infantry, evacuate wounded, or tow anti-tank guns depending on what was loaded into it. This standardization simplified production and logistics while maintaining operational flexibility. The timing was fortuitous. Britain needed massive vehicle production to replace equipment lost during the France campaign and Dunkirk evacuation. The Universal carrier's simple design allowed rapid production using existing automotive manufacturing capacity. Within months, British factories were producing hundreds of carriers weekly, and the vehicle began appearing in units across all theaters. The Normandy proof. The Normandy campaign demonstrated Universal carriers' mature operational employment. British and Canadian forces landing on D-Day brought thousands of carriers that immediately proved essential for operations in bocage terrain that favored defenders and stymied armor. The hedgerows, ancient earth banks topped with dense vegetation, created natural defensive positions that tanks struggled to overcome. Wheeled vehicles couldn't climb the banks or traverse muddy fields between hedgerows. Infantry advancing on foot was vulnerable to German machine guns, covering the narrow lanes between fields. The Universal carrier provided solution. It could cross hedgerows that stopped trucks, carry infantry that needed protection during advances, and mount weapons that suppressed German defensive positions. Carrier-mounted Bren guns provided mobile fire support that followed infantry advances closely. As British troops worked through hedgerow fields, carriers would position at field edges, fire bursts to suppress German positions, then advance to next hedgerow when infantry had cleared the ground. This leapfrog advance maintained fire superiority while minimizing exposure time in German killing zones. Ammunition supply became critical during sustained hedgerow fighting. Infantry consumed enormous quantities during extended small unit actions that characterized bocage combat. Carriers maintained supply flow by shuttling between forward units and rear ammunition points, operating in conditions where larger supply vehicles were too vulnerable or couldn't reach due to terrain and German fire. Casualty evacuation was equally important. The bocage fighting produced steady stream of wounded requiring rapid evacuation to aid stations. Carriers transported wounded through terrain and under fire conditions that would have forced stretcher-bearers to expose themselves for extended periods. The rough ride was acceptable, given that alternative was wounded men dying before reaching medical care. British after-action reports from Normandy consistently praised carrier performance. One battalion commander noted that his unit's operational effectiveness was directly proportional to carrier availability. When carriers were operational, the battalion could advance, maintain supply, and evacuate wounded effectively. When carriers were damaged or unavailable, operational capability dropped substantially, even though infantry strength remained constant. The vehicles had become essential infrastructure that infantry operations depended upon completely. The tactical flexibility. The universal carrier's operational utility came from versatility rather than specialization. It couldn't perform any single task as well as specialized equipment, but it could perform almost any task adequately, and that adequacy proved more valuable than specialized excellence. Infantry transport was the most basic role. A carrier could move 4 infantrymen plus equipment across terrain that would bog down trucks. The soldiers sat exposed. The open top provided no overhead protection, but movement speed and cross-country capability compensated for vulnerability. Infantry units used carriers to move quickly between positions, to transport troops forward under fire, and to evacuate wounded under conditions where wheeled ambulances couldn't operate. Weapons platform was second role. Carriers mounted Bren light machine guns as standard armament, providing mobile fire support for infantry advances. Some variants mounted heavier Vickers machine guns for sustained fire missions. Others carried Boy's anti-tank rifles that could damage light vehicles and fortifications. The mounting was basic, essentially welding weapon pedestals to the carrier's hull, but it worked reliably and could be modified quickly as requirements changed. Ammunition supply was third role, perhaps most important. Infantry advances consumed enormous ammunition quantities, and maintaining supply under fire was a constant challenge. Carriers could transport ammunition from rear areas to forward positions, operating in conditions where supply trucks were too vulnerable or couldn't reach due to terrain. They became mobile ammunition dumps that moved with advancing troops, ensuring that machine guns and mortars remained supplied even during fluid operations. Casualty evacuation was fourth role, saving countless lives through rapid medical transport. Wounded soldiers could be loaded into carriers and transported to aid stations faster than stretcher bearers could move them on foot. The rough ride was unpleasant for wounded. Suspension was basic, and tracks transmitted every terrain irregularity to passengers, but speed compensated for discomfort. Getting wounded to medical care quickly improved survival rates substantially. Artillery towing was fifth role. The carrier could tow 6-pounder and 2-pounder anti-tank guns, allowing these weapons to be repositioned rapidly during combat. This mobility transformed anti-tank defense from static to dynamic, allowing gun crews to engage enemy armor, withdraw before being destroyed, and reposition for subsequent engagements. German armor found that British anti-tank guns they'd located and tried to eliminate had moved before they could be destroyed. Command and control was sixth role. Senior officers used carriers as mobile command posts, allowing them to move with advancing troops while maintaining radio communication and tactical oversight. The vehicles provided protection from small arms fire while preserving mobility that stationary command posts lacked. Commanders could personally observe combat situations, make decisions based on direct observation, then relocate before becoming targets. The German perspective. German forces encountered universal carriers across every theater and developed complicated relationships with vehicles they simultaneously dismissed as inadequate and feared for their ubiquity. Individual carriers posed minimal threat. 7 millimeters of armor couldn't stop German anti-tank weapons, and the open top made crews vulnerable to small arms fire from any angle. But the sheer numbers created problems that individual vehicle inadequacy couldn't explain. Unteroffizier Carl Schmidt commanded an infantry section in North Africa and recorded his experiences with British carriers in letters that survived the war. One passage from November 1942 captured German frustration. "The British metal boxes are everywhere. We destroy them regularly. The armor is pathetic. Any anti-tank rifle penetrates easily. But destroying 5 accomplishes nothing because 10 more appear. They bring ammunition to British positions we're trying to suppress. They evacuate British wounded before we can capture them. They scout our positions and report to British artillery. Individually, they're negligible. Collectively, they're impossible to eliminate. It's like fighting locusts. Killing one means nothing when thousands remain." This assessment appeared repeatedly in German combat reports. The universal carrier wasn't dangerous individually, but was dangerous systematically through sheer numerical superiority and operational flexibility. German units could destroy every carrier they encountered and still face fresh vehicles the following day because British replacement capacity exceeded German destruction capacity by orders of magnitude. The psychological impact shouldn't be underestimated. German soldiers learned that British forces would never lack transport, ammunition, or evacuation capability as long as carriers remained operational. This knowledge undermined tactical successes. Pinning down British infantry accomplished little if carriers could resupply them continuously. Destroying British equipment was temporary victory because replacements would arrive shortly. The carrier represented British industrial capacity made manifest on tactical level. German attempts to develop equivalent vehicles failed repeatedly. The Germans built various half-tracks and armored personnel carriers, but never matched universal carriers' combination of simplicity, production volume, and operational flexibility. German vehicles were better engineered, more capable, more specialized, and consequently more expensive, more complex, and produced in far smaller numbers. British pragmatism defeated German precision through overwhelming quantity. The improvised modifications. The universal carrier's simple design invited modification, and crews across all theaters improvised improvements that ranged from practical to bizarre. The vehicle became platform for experimentation as soldiers discovered new capabilities through trial and error. Armor improvements appeared first. Crews welded additional steel plates to hull fronts, creating jury-rigged armor that might stop heavy machine gun rounds or shell fragments. The modifications added weight and reduced speed, but crews judged the trade-off worthwhile. Some units created standardized modification patterns that were applied systematically to entire carrier complements. Weapon mounting became creative exercise. The standard Bren gun was often supplemented or replaced with heavier weapons as crews discovered what worked. Vickers machine guns provided sustained fire capability. Boy's anti-tank rifles gave anti-armor capability despite their minimal effectiveness against modern tanks. Some crews mounted multiple weapons, creating mobile fire platforms that could engage various target types. In Italy, one battalion mounted flamethrowers on carriers for bunker assault roles, though this modification was abandoned after several crews were killed when fuel tanks were hit by enemy fire. The Piat anti-tank weapon appeared on some carriers, welded to improvised mounts that allowed crew members to fire while remaining partially protected by the carrier's hull. This provided infantry units with mobile anti-tank capability, though accuracy while moving was poor and most crews dismounted to fire properly. The modifications demonstrated creative thinking about tactical problems, even if practical effectiveness was limited. Environmental modifications reflected operational theaters. North African carriers received sand shields to prevent track mechanisms from clogging. Italian campaign vehicles got additional armor on floors to protect against mines. Pacific theater carriers were fitted with jungle equipment, machetes, extra water storage, tropical medical supplies. Each modification represented lessons learned through combat experience and applied systematically across units. Personal equipment accumulated organically. Crews attached stowage boxes for personal gear, spare parts, and ammunition. Tea kettles became standard equipment. British soldiers maintained tea consumption even in combat, and carriers provided convenient brewing platforms. Camouflage evolved from theater to theater as crews learned what worked against specific enemies in specific terrains. By 1944, experienced carrier crews had transformed standard vehicles into highly personalized equipment that reflected accumulated combat wisdom. The mass production reality. Britain's industrial mobilization transformed the universal carrier from utility vehicle into ubiquitous military equipment through production scale that made the vehicle effectively disposable. Between 1940 and 1945, British factories produced approximately 113,000 universal carriers. Canadian facilities added another 34,000. Smaller production runs occurred in Australia and New Zealand. The total approached 150,000 vehicles, more than any other armored vehicle produced during the war. This production volume created logistics revolution. Instead of carefully husbanding scarce vehicles and conducting extensive maintenance to keep them operational, units could treat carriers as semi-expendable equipment. If a carrier was damaged beyond immediate field repair, abandon it and request replacement. If a carrier was lost in combat, another would arrive within days. The vehicle's low cost, approximately £1,000 sterling, meant that replacing destroyed carriers was economically feasible in ways that replacing tanks never was. Ford of Canada's production facility in Windsor, Ontario, became the world's largest carrier manufacturer, producing more than the entire British output. Canadian production used different components than British versions, particularly different engines and transmissions, but maintained interoperability with British equipment. This meant British and Canadian units could share maintenance facilities, spare parts, and operational procedures, despite vehicles having different internal specifications. The production was decentralized across dozens of facilities rather than concentrated in single factories. This approach reduced vulnerability to bombing. Destroying one factory might reduce production, but couldn't eliminate it entirely. Shadow factories, civilian automotive plants converted to military production, contributed substantial output without requiring purpose-built military manufacturing infrastructure. Production tempo increased throughout the war, rather than declining. Monthly output in 1940 averaged perhaps 500 vehicles. By 1942, monthly production exceeded 2,000 vehicles. Peak production in 1944 approached 3,000 vehicles monthly as Allied forces prepared for European invasion operations requiring massive equipment quantities. The vehicles rolled off production lines and immediately deployed to units worldwide. Some carriers were in combat within weeks of manufacture. Others sat in depot storage waiting for deployment. The sheer volume meant that every Commonwealth infantry battalion possessed carriers. Every artillery regiment had them. Every armored division included them. They became as fundamental to British military operations as rifles or ammunition. The unglamorous truth. The universal carrier was never glamorous. It never inspired the passion that Spitfires generated or the respect that Churchill tanks commanded. It was a metal box on tracks that made noise, threw mud, and provided minimal protection. Crews complained about exposure to weather, rough rides, mechanical breakdowns, and general inadequacy for almost any specific task. But it worked. It worked reliably, continuously, and universally across every theatre and every type of operation that Commonwealth forces conducted. It represented British pragmatism in material form. Build something adequate rather than perfect. Produce enough that losses don't matter, and trust soldiers to use equipment creatively to solve tactical problems. The vehicle's greatest strength was that it was good enough, not excellent at any single role, but adequate at dozens of roles, produced in quantities that made it universally available, simple enough that minimally trained mechanics could maintain it, and reliable enough that crews trusted it would function when required. These unglamorous virtues created effectiveness that exceeded many technically superior vehicles that were produced in smaller quantities or required extensive maintenance support. Lance Corporal Thomas Webb served in a carrier crew through North African, Italian, and European campaigns. His assessment, recorded in 1946, captured soldiers' relationship with the vehicle. "We called it a metal coffin, a sardine tin, a farm tractor with delusions. We complained about everything: the noise, the exposure, the rough ride, the inadequate armor. But when we needed to move under fire, we climbed in. When we needed to evacuate wounded, we loaded them aboard. When we needed ammunition forward, we drove it there. The carrier was ugly, uncomfortable, and barely adequate for anything. But it was always there, always worked, and always got us through. That's more than you could say for most equipment we received. We trusted it precisely because it never pretended to be more than it was, just a functional box on tracks that did its job." That assessment defined the Universal Carrier's legacy. It was the vehicle that never failed despite never being impressive, that performed every role despite being optimized for none, that served everywhere despite being designed for nowhere in particular. It represented British military philosophy made mechanical: practical over perfect, reliable over revolutionary, adequate over excellent. The farm tractor that became war's most produced armored vehicle did so not through technical brilliance, but through systematic adequacy multiplied by overwhelming quantity. It was never the best vehicle for any mission, but it was available for every mission, and availability combined with adequate performance proved more valuable than limited quantities of superior equipment. German forces that faced universal carriers learned this lesson repeatedly. You couldn't eliminate what was everywhere, couldn't overcome what was endlessly replaced, couldn't counter what performed adequately across every role. The vehicle's ubiquity became its weapon, making it simultaneously insignificant individually and overwhelming collectively. That paradox defined the Universal Carrier's contribution to Allied victory. It was the vehicle that mattered most precisely because it never mattered, especially the equipment that enabled everything while being specially suited for nothing, the machine that won through persistence rather than excellence. In a war increasingly decided by industrial capacity and material superiority, the Universal Carrier embodied the principle that adequate capability produced in massive quantities defeats superior capability produced in limited numbers. The Germans built better vehicles, the British built more vehicles, and when the war ended, British forces still had thousands of Universal Carriers operational, while German forces had collapsed partly through inability to maintain their more sophisticated equipment. The sardine tin on tracks had outlasted everything through the simple virtue of being good enough, everywhere, always.